Well, good evening, everybody. Whoa, sorry. It's hotter than I thought. And thank you so much for coming out on this perfect spring evening. I don't know if I didn't have to be here that I would be here. I hope everybody was able to grab something to eat. The food looks really good. How many of you have been here before for either the visioning or another comp plan meeting? Nice, a little more than half, cool. Thank you for your continued willingness to help guide your city. Tonight we will be focused on housing. And in many ways, I think this will be the most interesting subject in the entire comp plan process. We don't get to choose whether our city grows. That's a market force. What we do get to choose is how our city grows. You all helped create a vision for 2040 that reflects our collective assessment on how to grow responsibly, sustainably, and equitably. We adopted that vision on September 5th, 2017. For the past 18 months, the City Council, the Comp Plan Advisory Committee, and the planners have been exploring how the city's adopted vision informs decisions regarding an update to the city's comprehensive plan. So far, we've looked at policies related to economic development, growth management, public involvement, natural hazards, energy, and climate change. Now it's time to focus on housing and the housing policies that will shape the next 20 years of growth in the city. We need to consider how we create opportunities for housing that can both accommodate newcomers and allow longtime residents to be able to afford to stay in the community. Now that's a really important piece that I want you to really wrap your heads around. Over the last several years, we've lost a lot of community members because they simply couldn't afford to live here anymore. So we have to make sure that there's housing available that they will be able to afford. Tonight, we'll talk about where new housing can go and what types of housing are appropriate. We will consider those questions while applying 4 evaluation lenses related to equity, sustainability, affordability, and livability. This process will allow us to discuss how we can achieve the city's vision and avoid unintended consequences. Can affordable housing also be sustainable and equitable? Can our large areas of single-family housing accommodate a broader range of housing types and densities without compromising the character of the neighborhoods? Can focused development along transportation corridors limit pressure on growing denser in forested neighborhoods? We believe that there are ways to responsibly balance the benefits and impacts and achieve the city's vision. Tonight, we want to hear from you and hear your guidance and best thinking for how our city can creatively approach 3 areas of the city: city centers, corridors and neighborhood hubs, shared residential neighborhoods. But before I turn this over to Matt Hasty, our consultant team, to provide an overview of underlying trends and issues, I want to provide some things for you to think about during his presentation and during your working time in the small groups. Some of you may have joined us back in early December when we had a forum at Clackamas Community College's Harmony campus. And we had a talk by Richard Rothstein, who is the author of a book called The Color of Law. Mr. Rothstein noted in his talk and in his book that many of the state, local, and federal housing policies put in place after World War II had the effect of creating more segregated communities and regions, both in terms of economic and racial segregation. As we look at our policies with an equity lens, how do we ensure that our policies and actions don't reinforce the segregation of the past? How can our land use regulations and housing policies be refined to help reverse rather than exacerbate these conditions? In some ways, the land use policies and zoning put in place years ago have had the effect of excluding people who have lower incomes from certain areas in our community. As a result, many longtime residents would not be able to afford to live in their own neighborhood if they were moving there today. How can our policies support both affordability and sustainability? For example, denser development could lead to the loss of trees in some situations, and use of sustainable materials and features while reducing long-term maintenance and repair costs can increase the cost to build and purchase or rent a home. I hope we can find a balance that allows us to find ways to add housing while maintaining the rich green environment that we enjoy in Milwaukie. Think about our transit corridors and our proposed neighborhood hubs. One of the most exciting ideas to come out of the community vision was the concept of the neighborhood hubs. These are places in your neighborhood where there might be a corner coffee shop or a pub or a store maybe that would serve as a community gathering place. The hubs, along with the transit corridors, offer opportunities for residents to walk to places to shop, eat, and gather. This can improve our physical health, give us opportunities, and meet and see our friends and neighbors. And this also benefits the planet by reducing greenhouse gas emissions from drives that you might take further out of the city to do the same things. Finally, consider gentle density. Allowing small increases in density throughout the city can provide much needed relief to the current housing crunch. ADUs, which some of you may not know, it's additional dwelling unit. So like a mother-in-law's cottage in the back or something like that. Duplexes, garden apartments, and cottage cluster development can help provide housing at prices and rents below the current market rates. In last year's home buying season, the median home price in Milwaukie was $400,000. While that may be good news for those that own a home, it's a price tag that is far out of reach for many of us. In fact, 85% of your neighbors might not qualify to purchase a home at that price. If we do nothing, we will only add to rising prices and displacement. It's important to add housing options to keep Milwaukie the livable community that we all love. We believe that there are ways to responsibly balance the benefits and impacts of different housing options. Tonight, we want to hear from you about your ideas, visions, and experiences, and to get your best thoughts on how the city can address this housing crisis. Now I'd like to bring up our consultant, Matt Hasty, with Angela Planning Group, to give us some background info and outline tonight's process. Thank you again for coming.
All right. Thank you, Mayor Gamba, and thank all you for being here tonight, again, on such a lovely day out there. So I'll expand a little bit and provide a little bit more information and detail on some of the things that the mayor talked about, and I'll briefly describe kind of the process for the rest of the evening and for the exercises what you want you all to go through at your tables. I'll do that in the next 10 or 15 minutes and then kind of turn it over to all of you for most of the rest of the meeting. So again, I'll take care of that. Then really the bulk of the meeting is for you to talk about some of the issues the mayor has already raised and that I'll talk about further, and to, again, give us some advice about from your perspective and the perspectives of the different issues we've been raising, where you think different types of housing are most appropriate to be located in the future in Milwaukie, and why, and what are the advantages and disadvantages of some of those recommendations. So moving into kind of the presentation, the mayor talked about equity. We can kind of think about this in some different ways, both in terms of geography. Do people have choices where they live in terms of the opportunities they have? Are they based on their income or their race? Are their choices more limited, or are they adversely impacted by specific policies that the city has, or decisions or regulations that the city implements? So we want to think about it from that perspective. The mayor talked about this slide a moment ago. I won't repeat it too much, but just to reiterate that the last 50 to 100 years, policies, not just in Portland, but across the region and across the country, have created unequal situations for people of color and people of low income here and elsewhere. This next slide is just kind of talks about how that still plays out in certain places here. Whoa, sorry about that. In that minorities and single parents tend to be more vulnerable to rent burden and eviction. I'll talk about rent burden in a moment in terms of what that means. Whoops. Oh, thought I had a map in there in the middle, but I don't. In terms of affordability, you probably hear the word affordability kind of used a lot and sometimes in different ways. The way we're thinking of it here is that ideally, people or households should not need to spend more than a certain amount of their income on housing, because if they are spending more than that amount of money on housing, they don't have it to spend on transportation, on food, on other things that they need in life. And the kind of typical threshold that we think about there is 30%. So no matter how much money you make, you ideally should not be spending more than 30% of that on your housing. And if you are, that then meets the definition of being rent burdened. So in looking at Milwaukie, 32% of homeowners in Milwaukie are moderately mortgage burdened. So they're spending more than 30% of their income on their mortgage and utilities. For renters, the situation's a little worse. 51% are moderately rent burdened, spending more than 30%, and 27%, actually I think this is closer to 25% right now, are spending more than 50% of their incomes on housing and associated expenses. So that's a pretty significant chunk of their income. This is related to a number of things. One, so housing prices have increased by 58% in Milwaukie since, I believe this is since 2000, the year 2000. They've actually increased even faster in the state. So Milwaukee's hasn't increased as fast as the state, but they're kind of catching up in terms of recent increases. In terms of rental housing, the prices haven't increased quite as rapidly, but again, within this region, we've seen some pretty rapid increases over the last several years, and these are adjusted for inflation. So prices have increased, wages have not kept up with that, so you're seeing sort of more and more households paying a larger percentage of their income for housing. And certain types of housing tend to cost less and be affordable to people with lower incomes. Multifamily housing, I'll talk about different types of housing and show you some images in a moment, but multifamily housing, generally think about those as apartments. That's about 12% of the housing stock within the city of Milwaukie. Things that we'll call middle housing, duplexes, accessory dwelling units, triplexes, things like that. That's about a quarter of the housing stock. And the majority of it is just single family homes, a home on an individual lot. So those on average tend to cost more in terms of either the mortgage or the rental rate. And this just kind of I'll sort of point out particularly the chart on the right shows that in terms of land zoned for these different types of housing, a fairly small percentage is zoned for things like apartments and those middle housing types. That's 13% of the total. 70% of the total is zoned for single-family detached housing. The rest is for commercial and industrial use, basically. One of the types of housing we'll talk about, and you'll see some images on your tables, is called cottage cluster housing. These are basically small individual homes that are kind of grouped around a common courtyard or open space area. Most parts of the city don't allow that type of housing, even though it's really similar to kind of typical homes on individual lots in a lot of ways. This 5%, a little misleading because it includes industrial areas, so you probably think of it as more like in the 70s in that sense. And only about 10% of city zones allow for apartments, which tend to be, frankly, the most affordable type of development for a lot of households in Milwaukie. So we talked about these four kind of lenses to look at: equity, affordability, sustainability is another one. We're going to focus partly here, or in large part, on kind of environmental sustainability. These are a couple of statements from from your vision that talk about sustainable use of resources in terms of use of renewable resources, and ways of living that reduce impacts on natural resources or conserve natural resources. Just a couple of specific examples of policies or goals that the city has. One is to increase tree canopy within the city from the existing 26% to 40%. A lot of benefits of trees in terms of environmental sustainability, and that's a goal of the city to do that by 2040. Another way to think about this is just in terms of the homes we live in, to design them in ways that better use solar energy, passive solar energy to heat the home, to heat the water in the home, to provide natural sunlight and reduce use of electricity for that. So just some different ways to think about sustainability from that standpoint. Livability, really broad term, I will say. I had to go out and kind of look for, I use this term a lot, and probably a lot of us do, but I had to go looking for a definition so I could really articulate it for myself and hopefully for you. This is one I thought was pretty good. It says the ability to meet community members' economic, social, and cultural needs and promote their health and well-being. Again, that's pretty broad. That says a lot of things, but that's kind of my definition tonight of livability. The city's vision talks about livability in large part in terms of having livable neighborhoods that provide people with access to a lot of different things, including places to meet, gather, shop, recreate, etc. And the mayor talked about the neighborhood hubs concept that came out of the city's visioning process, and that's a lot of what that concept is oriented to. Show you kind of a, oh, I do have a map of that. But just other things to think about in terms of livability, having access to just light and air within your homes and outside your homes. Again, places to recreate, places to meet your neighbors and friends and colleagues. I think one of the components of livability people think about is just liking what you see around you, living in a place that to you is attractive in terms of both the buildings, but also just the landscape. This is a map of those neighborhood hubs. It's a kind of a good segue in a moment to the maps around your table and one of the things they show. The other thing just to think about in terms of planning for housing, a thing that us planners think about is what are the impacts of where and what type of housing is located in the city on the ability to serve them with public facilities and infrastructure, things like the city's wastewater treatment plant, things like the water supply, the impact of development and growth on roads and other transportation services, parks, police, fire, et cetera. So those are things we all have to think about when we think about how the city grows, as the mayor said. So next I'm going to kind of quickly walk through some of these different types of housing that we've started to talk about, and you'll have images and more information about these types of housing at your tables. The mayor mentioned ADUs, accessory dwelling units. Essentially, it's a housing unit that's secondary or accessory to a primary home on an individual lot. It can be connected, it can be separate, it can be within the existing home. Different ways to do this. Some images there. I said plexes because there's duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes. These are all essentially individual homes that share walls with each other. And they're basically either 2 homes or housing units, 3 or 4. So duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes. Rowhouses or townhomes, I think you're all probably familiar with these, having seen them either here or in other places. They're essentially attached, discrete units, but again, share walls with the homes on either side of them. Cottage clusters, I mentioned this one earlier. Again, it's a series or a collection of smaller detached units, so standalone homes that are oriented around a common open space. Typically, things like parking are also shared. Sometimes they'll have like another building that's a shared recreation space or gathering space for people who live in that collection of homes. Courtyard Apartments are sort of like the apartment version of Cottage Cluster. You've probably seen these in a lot of cities, if not Milwaukie and other places around the region. So they're small groups of apartments also clustered around typically a courtyard or a common open space. Apartments, anything with 5 units or more in a single building or a cluster of buildings, depending on how big, if it's an apartment building or an apartment complex. And then mixed use is essentially tends to be apartments above ground floor businesses. So those are typically shops or restaurants, coffee shops, things like that. So those are the types of different housing you're going to be thinking about tonight in this next exercise. Just a quick a minute or two about kind of what's the city's role in all this? What does the city do related to housing? What doesn't it do? Well, for the most part, the city itself does not build housing. The city doesn't directly control the wages or the incomes of most of the people in the city. The people that work for them, they do, to some degree. They don't establish housing prices. They don't control the housing market. But they do a number of things that do have an impact on housing in the city. They manage land and allow for certain types of housing in certain portions of the city, and that's in large part what kind of the rest of this meeting is going to be focused on. They also support organizations who do build housing, particularly for people kind of at the lower end of the income spectrum, because that's where that private housing market tends to not meet people's needs. So the city can help support those organizations who can't just build that housing based on what somebody can afford to pay. And they can also provide incentives to develop or build certain types of housing in certain areas based on what city policy and city residents think is important. Just the city has been doing a lot. This isn't sort of the first time, you know, the city's starting to do things related to housing. So they have a bunch of different programs sort of already being implemented under the umbrella of the city's housing affordability strategy that relate to this. I'm not going to take the time to go into this in detail, but all of these things are sort of related to, in large part, providing support or assistance to meet the needs, particularly of people at lower income rates, low to moderate income rates. And a lot of them are really working with other organizations across the city. And they're also engaging right now in a number of studies that relate kind of directly to some of the things we're going to talk about now or talk about tonight, related to cottage cluster housing, accessory dwelling units, related to the concept or idea of equity in terms of housing around the city. And again, we're here really to talk about something that will inform the city's comprehensive plan policies related to housing. So that's kind of ultimately the gist of this. And again, working with a lot of partners, which I listed up here, the state, Clackamas County, a number of nonprofit housing developers and advocates around the city, as well as market rate housing developers, neighborhood associations, and all of you. So the rest of the meeting, at each of your tables, you're going to go through an exercise of identifying in different types of areas within the city, and your facilitators at each table will describe this in a little bit more detail, but each of you has a map at your table. It shows different types of areas. The darkest color represents essentially the downtown, central Milwaukie, and the Tacoma Station area. Those are the areas where currently kind of the most intensive types of housing are allowed. The orange areas represent areas close to transit and also areas that may be located in some initial neighborhood hub location areas. And then the yellow is kind of everything else. Those tend to be where right now it's primarily single-family homes. And your job is to recommend as a table kind of where you think some of the different types of housing we've been talking about ought to appropriately be located in the future. And why. We want you to have some discussions about why does it make sense to make those recommendations, what are the trade-offs, what are the advantages and disadvantages, who benefits from what you might suggest, who doesn't benefit. So that's really the point of the exercise y'all are going to be engaged in for the next hour or so. And it'll be broken up into a couple of phases, and your facilitators will talk about this a little bit more, but the first phase is sort of a quick, put some images on the map that represent your really first quick cut at doing this. You don't all have to absolutely agree on what you put on the map in those first 15 minutes. Then take the next 45 minutes to actually talk about it in more detail and come to some kind of group conclusion about what makes the most sense, represented on your map, tape down the pictures so we can all see that. And then the last part of the meeting, we'll have some time for y'all to report back to us, just a couple of kind of highlights of what you talked about at your tables. You'll figure out who does that at your tables. Take volunteers, or one of the facilitators or note takers will do that. And also, you all have some packets at your tables that include comment forms and questionnaires, and we're going to want you to fill those out during the time that you're here before you leave. And leave them with us. So I think we're just about almost to the end of me talking and letting you talk for the rest of the meeting. In terms of next steps, sort of almost concurrently with this meeting, we're doing something similar online. We're having an online open house. That's going to be ready to roll, bridge or win, next week. So next week, you will be able to do this online, or really encourage your friends, neighbors, colleagues to do this online. It will be a similar exercise, not exactly the same, but as similar as we can make it online. There will be additional meetings of the city's Comprehensive Plan Advisory Committee over the coming months, and including a sort of a separate committee that is looking at and talking about housing policy in particular. And what comes out of this meeting tonight will be a really important input into their discussions about what are the policies that should go into the city's comp plan related to housing. And there will be more comprehensive plan meetings in the coming months as well, and other opportunities for y'all to kind of weigh in on the same topic as well as other topics related to the comprehensive plan. So I'm done talking. Thank you for being patient and listening, and go to it. All right, we're going to get started on the table reports. I'm going to start with David over here, David's table. Blue table number 2. You guys ready? David, are you ready? All right, do it. Okay. And again, everybody has about a minute, so just quick highlights.
Hi, I'm Maitri. I live in Llewellyn. I was nominated for this. So we spent a lot of time talking about affordability and just trying to do as many things to make housing more affordable in Milwaukee, including incentivizing affordability for new units, focusing on alternative housing options such as livable, intentional communities, AKA Bridge Meadows. We talked about that. We also talked about the importance of sustainability, and we talked about just a lot of stuff, but really we kind of just kept coming back to affordability and how important it was to do what we can. And none of us were NIMBYs at this table, so we were embracing kind of everything, and that's great. So anything else you guys wanted to add? We're good? Okay, thank you. I wanted to keep this short. So.
Nice job. Thank you. All right. What's your table, Denny? Howie. All right, here you go, Howie.
All right. Our overwhelming, I think, takeaway is that the feeling of, mixing things up and adding a diverse, adding different types of housing in these neighborhoods is going to be, really make the city a much more vibrant and exciting place to live, as long as it's done in a way that, respects the character of the neighborhoods. But I think everybody, there weren't any NIMBYs here either, everybody was really excited about making the community more livable by having the diversity. And especially there was some interest in cottage clusters sort of in neighborhoods, but also, doing it in a way that doesn't destroy the fabric of the neighborhood, but, definitely a lot of interest in mixing things up.
All right, thank you. All right, yellow table number, whichever one is this?
Yellow one. Hi, I'm Robert Massey. So, our major takeaway was affordability. And, echoing what's already been said is that we wanted to diversify the types of housing so that we could increase that supply and keep the prices down. And there was a lot of talk about how to do that, and I heard some things I hadn't heard that weren't on the menu, and one of those was, let's just get the zoning done so that we can put units above garages, housing units above garages. And the second one I heard was that we talked about is the social aspect being so important. So there was a lot of talk about hubs, having shopping options in neighborhoods, places where the community can come together and that kind of thing. And I also heard another one that I hadn't really considered, and that was, we got a lot of single use retail. We got a lot of strip malls. Why don't those become mixed use? Why don't they have the retail and commercial on the first floor and housing above? Because we've got, a lot of footprint with single use.
All right. Thank you, Robert. All right. Table Espanol.
Hi, my name is Ernestina Fuenmayor. I first wanted to thank the City of Milwaukee for taking the time to hire the companies on various issues, and they have helped the Spanish community, the Latin community, to get together. We got together actually on Tuesday first. We talk about all this, and we provide a lot of comments. Today we kind of talk a little bit more about it, but I just want everybody to know that we've been talking before this about these issues, and they're very interesting in all of this. I'm going to talk about it first in Spanish and then later in English. So, la comunidad latina se concentra en las zonas unifamiliares, viven en las zonas unifamiliares. con familias grandes, que busca la seguridad, espacios verdes, estacionamientos para los vehículos, acceso a las autopistas, a transporte público y a servicios sociales y cívicos. Preferimos que la alta densidad de viviendas esté en zonas del centro y en corredores viales. Nos preocupa el aumento de la inseguridad y la falta de estacionamiento, nos preocupan los altos costos de viviendas de 3 y más habitaciones. Queremos lugares seguros para nuestros hijos, que puedan caminar a las escuelas y al parque. El costo de la vivienda podría marginar a las personas que quieren vivir allí. Queremos grupos que sean non-profit, que podrían ayudar a las personas de bajos recursos. Queríamos donde los programas de ayuda económica para comprar viviendas las ofrezcan en todos lados y no exclusivamente en una zona en la periferia. Y creemos que la diversidad de viviendas por toda la ciudad de Milwaukee podría promover la diversidad y la inclusión. Now in English. This Hispanic community or the Latin community is mostly living in areas that are single-family houses. We have big families. We like the security of those spaces. We like green spaces. We want places for parking our cars, access to highways and public transportation, and services, social services, schools, and economic places. We prefer that the higher density housing will be located in the downtown areas and in the corridors and the hubs. We are worried about probably the insecurity that might increase with the higher density. We are worried about the lack of parking spaces. We are also worried that how this higher density might increase the prices for more than 3 or more bedrooms housing. That's what families require and need. We like the places for our kids to be safe, that they can walk to our schools and to the parks. We think that the cost of the housing is keeping people away from the areas in Milwaukee, and they have to live in the periphery area, instead of they want to actually live inside. They don't want to live just in the outside, in the skirts. We want nonprofit groups to help people from low income to actually be affordable for these places, the housing here, and that this economic helps or aids for buying houses in Milwaukee will be inclusive for all areas, not exclusive to in specific areas that usually are actually in areas where we don't really want to live. And then we think that one of the advantages of promoting different housing types is that we're going to have more diversity and inclusion in this space. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Gracias. All right, Bridger. Is it you or Tiffany? Where's Tiffany? I'm sorry, Tiffany.
So our group also took a strong equity lens toward this housing issue, and we thought it would be prudent to responsibly add more apartments along transit areas that are already high density, because for me, I was actually one of the people displaced by the rental market last year. I moved 3 times. I was one of the 50% whose rental went up more than 30%. So I saw the lack of apartments in Milwaukee as being an issue, but then we also diversified what you can do with single dwelling houses, maybe AUDs, being tiny houses, or building on top of an existing, like somebody mentioned, on top of garages, or like a 3rd story on top of a 2nd story with a different entrance. So just diversifying the types of housing in general can help make it more equitable and still maintain its livability.
Thank you. All right.
Hello, my name is Albert, and our group first jumped in, like the last group, talking about building more apartments and townhouses around the Tacoma station, more specifically because there's already one going in the Milwaukie Marketplace station. Generally, our group agrees with upzoning and building more higher density houses within our areas, but more specifically the orange areas, the center and corridors. And there was one comment which suggests that mixed uses will be pretty good if they were on the border of the orange and yellow areas. And for the historical center, people mentioned that ADUs can be built in the basements of the historical homes, since they tend to have basements. And also there was a comment on using the parking lots around townhouses, the spaces there, more effectively, and not leave them as parking lot and empty spaces. And we ended with maybe the suggestion of houseboats on the river. So.
Thank you, Albert. All right. Let's see. Who's reporting over here? Celestina?
All right. We were a very adoptive group, so we put many of the housing options in many of the different zones, largely also in the orange zone, however, quite a few options in the yellow area as well. Vera, who's not here anymore, highlighted 3 important parts in our notes. One of them was just that we talked a lot about the financial costs to build some of these things, especially for existing homeowners, and wanting to make sure that we prioritize feasibility in terms of financial feasibility to do ADUs, or even improving upon larger lots with more detached units. Additionally, most of our conversations seemed to be around what it was going to feel like to be there, so height and scale of some of the larger developments, some of the row houses we felt were potentially okay in some places, but if they were going to really impact a direct neighbor and the livability of that neighbor, then maybe that's not the right place for them. And then a couple people at our table really wanted to add to the discussion mobile homes. Tiny homes, RVs, and it wasn't really a part of the project today, but we ended up making different little tokens about where we might put those.
Excellent. Thank you. All right. I'm going to do my best to report for our table over here. They told me they would tell me if I get anything wrong. They're not shy. So generally, I'll say that we recommended promoting more apartments and mixed use in the darker areas, the central Milwaukie, the downtown areas, the station area. We didn't totally follow the rules as I tried to, state them here. In terms of, in some of the orange areas, the corridors or hub areas, we recommended promoting or having more apartments in areas where there's already more of a mix of apartments, single family, other types of housing, but where there's less of a mix, we didn't recommend promoting as many of those denser types of housing. In the kind of primarily single family zones, we thought duplexes are a good idea, accessory dwelling units are a good idea. We were sort of back and forth and had mixed opinions about Courtyard Apartments. Some folks at our table thought that's a good thing, they can really fit into the scale of the neighborhood. Other people were concerned that, look, if you came into that neighborhood really for a certain type of neighborhood, then instigating a lot of change in there is going to be difficult and maybe not the best idea for everybody. So that's my interpretation. Am I okay? Generally, all right, cool. All right, so next table.
I don't think we have anything that much new to add. We also were pretty in agreement about increasing density, but trying to balance that with livability. So in the yellow areas, being very mindful of the scale of things. So the idea of putting in multifamily units would be fine, but not big 5-story multifamily units if you're surrounded by single-family houses. So things like the Courtyard Apartments were more appealing to us because they would be on the same scale as the surrounding houses. We also were supportive of the idea of places that already have density, increasing that density, using it to its full potential. One thing we did talk about a little bit at our table that was not mentioned at all, and I think is worth mentioning, is the idea of transitional housing, which is temporary housing that gets homeless people off the streets and gives them a chance to actually get back into society and then into low-income housing from there. And then the other thing we touched on a little bit was the pros and cons of rentals versus owned units, and the fact that home ownership is a way for people to build wealth and security, whereas if they are stuck being renters their entire lives, then they're constantly paying out into somebody else's pockets.
Excellent. Thank you. All right. Kim.
Okay, I'll hit the high points. So we also talked about home ownership and access to home ownership. We talked a lot about livability and really being for the city to be intentional about thinking about, increased car parking and increased traffic and making sure that our infrastructure can accommodate that kind of growth. So really thinking about livability, and along with that, offering opportunities to get to know our neighbors a little bit better, because there's been people moving in and folks don't feel like they are really connected now. And then if there's more growth, there's some concern about that. So livability was a big topic for us. And again, we had a healthy debate about some parking. So that was fun. And then we talked about, we had a suggestion for regarding mixed use, that the Oak Street Mall should be mixed use with senior housing on the top.
Awesome. And I'm always glad to hear somebody had a fun debate about parking, because, hey, why not? All right, last but definitely not least, Colin.
Thank you. We had some fantastic points, many fantastic points, which I am not going to share in the interest of time, but I'll mention just a couple things. We talked about making sure that all of the zones had the opportunity to become more dense by a moderate amount. No dramatically dropping apartments into those yellow areas, but that we didn't want to increase density just in the centers, for example, but spread it throughout all the neighborhoods. And in doing so, make it moderate, recognize that this is going to be pushing our boundaries, and allow it to push our boundaries, because it's always hard to see neighborhoods change. The other note was simply to consider the scale and the character of neighborhoods. It's very hard for us to look at a whole bunch of different orange areas or yellow areas and consider them all as the same thing. Individual areas do vary. So if there's some way for us to push toward not so abruptly changing parts of those neighborhoods that have a particular character, that would be a thing to consider as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Colin. And I'll say my group had a lot of similar discussion on that last point. So I'm going to turn it over to Councilor Beatty in a second here. Before I do that, because after she talks, you're pretty much done, unless you haven't filled out those comment forms. We would love you to fill out those comment forms before you leave and turn them in somewhere at the table up here. I think we're going to have a box up there for you. There it is. Yes, Mary's holding it up, waving it around. Very nice. So if you can spend a couple extra minutes to fill out the comment forms, if you haven't done it already, we would love you to do that. With that, I will turn it over to Councilor Beatty.
I want to thank everybody, as the mayor did at the beginning, for giving up a lovely evening to come in. I think we probably lost a few of our RSVPs to the weather today, but we really appreciate you guys coming in. I won't rehash all the things I heard, because you just heard a lot of them, but what it does tell me is how much work we still have to do to figure out the right balance. And like one of the questions raised at several tables was, how do you ensure affordability? And I think that is a tough challenge. As it was stated at the beginning, the city doesn't really control prices, but there are some incentives and some tools we can use to try and foster affordability. Anyway, the one thing I heard that I did want to address was I heard a couple of people say the city's already decided this or the city council wants that. And that's not true. There may be various people on the city council who want, you know, we all have our own opinions about things, but this is a process. It involves the Comprehensive Plan Advisory Committee, the Planning Commission, the City Council. It's about 25 people engaged in this process over the next year. So nothing is decided. Please fill out your surveys. Please tell your friends and neighbors to do the online survey when it comes out next week. If we have your email address, you will get notice of the online survey. So if you didn't leave an email address, please do so. And I don't think there's anything else I'd have to say, but thanks again for coming out and fill out those surveys.